October 25th, 1944, 6:45 in the morning, 70 miles east of the Philippine island of Samar. A young ensign in a torpedo bomber spots something through the low clouds that makes his blood run cold. Pagoda masts, the unmistakable silhouettes of Japanese battleships. And at their center, a vessel so massive it defies comprehension, the 72,000-ton Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, her 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling shells, weighing over 3,000 pounds more than 26 miles. The ensign's radio crackles with panic. He has just discovered that the most powerful surface fleet Japan ever assembled is bearing down on a handful of escort carriers and their thin-skinned escorts. There are no American battleships between this armada and 130,000 soldiers on the Leyte beaches. There are only 3 destroyers. What happens next will become the most extraordinary act of surface combat in modern naval warfare. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, each displacing barely 2,000 tons, will charge directly into the teeth of 4 Japanese battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. They will fight for nearly 3 hours. 2 of them will sink, and against every calculation of naval warfare, they will help turn back a force that should have annihilated them in minutes. This is the story of the Battle of Samar. This is the story of the last stand that saved an army. To understand how 3 American destroyers came to face the Japanese Imperial fleet alone, you must first understand the catastrophic chain of miscommunication that left them exposed. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in history, triggered by the American invasion of the Philippines on October 20th, 1944. Japan responded with Operation Show 1, a desperate 3-pronged naval counterattack designed to destroy the American invasion fleet. The stakes could not have been higher. The Philippines controlled the sea lanes between Japan and her conquered territories in the Dutch East Indies, the oil fields that kept the Imperial Navy afloat. Losing the Philippines meant losing the war. Japanese naval commanders understood this with perfect clarity. They were willing to sacrifice their entire fleet if it meant destroying the American invasion force. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force, the most powerful of the 3 Japanese formations. His fleet included 4 battleships, among them the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest and most heavily armed warships ever built. 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers completed his armada. Their mission was to transit San Bernardino Strait, descend on the invasion transports at Leyte Gulf, and slaughter the American soldiers while they were vulnerable on the beaches. If Kurita succeeded, the Philippine invasion would be crippled. Tens of thousands of Americans might die. The war could be prolonged by years. Vice Admiral Nishimura would attack through Surigao Strait from the south with a smaller force of 2 battleships and several destroyers. Vice Admiral Ozawa, commanding 4 aircraft carriers with barely 110 operational planes, would serve as bait. His northern force existed solely to lure Admiral William Halsey and his powerful Third Fleet away from San Bernardino Strait. Ozawa's pilots were mostly green recruits, with barely enough training to take off and land. His carriers were sacrifices, sheep dressed as wolves, sent to die so that Kurita might succeed. The trap worked perfectly. On October 24th, American carrier aircraft pounded Kurita's fleet in the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked throughout the day. The super battleship Musashi absorbed approximately 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before finally sinking, taking over 1,000 of her crew with her. She went down fighting, her anti-aircraft guns still firing as she slipped beneath the waves. Kurita appeared to turn back, and American reconnaissance assumed the threat from the west had been neutralized. That evening, when American reconnaissance spotted Ozawa's carriers to the north, Halsey made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He took the entirety of Third Fleet north to pursue the decoy carriers. Every fast battleship, every fleet carrier, every cruiser. The most powerful naval force in history went chasing empty carriers, while the real threat slipped through behind them. San Bernardino Strait stood unguarded. The miscommunication was built into the command structure itself. Halsey's Third Fleet reported to Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Kincaid's 7th Fleet reported to General MacArthur. There was no unified naval command, no single officer coordinating the movements of both fleets. Each assumed the other was handling San Bernardino Strait. Earlier that day, Halsey had sent a preparatory message stating that certain ships would be formed as Task Force 34 to guard the strait. Kinkaid and Nimitz both read this as a done deal. They believed powerful American battleships were standing watch, their 16-inch guns covering the approaches. A clarifying message Halsey sent at 1710 was never received by 7th Fleet. At 0300 on October 25th, Kurita's battered but still immensely powerful center force passed through a completely unguarded San Bernardino Strait and turned south along the coast of Samar. The darkness concealed their passage. No American patrol aircraft spotted them. No submarines lurked in their path. They emerged into the Philippine Sea with nothing between them and the invasion beaches except empty ocean. Kinkaid's heavy battleships were 130 miles to the south, critically low on ammunition after destroying Nishimura's force at Surigao Strait the previous night. The old battleships had fired nearly all their armor-piercing shells in that engagement. Even if they could reach Taffy 3 in time, they would be firing anti-aircraft rounds at Yamato. The only American units in Kurita's path were 3 small escort carrier groups, designated Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. These were not combat formations designed to fight battleships. They were converted merchant hulls, mass-produced ships, nicknamed jeep carriers or baby flatops, with a top speed of 19 knots, each carrying a single 5-inch gun and roughly 27 aircraft. Their thin steel hulls could be penetrated by machine gun fire. Their flight decks were constructed of wood over steel beams. Their destroyer screens were meant for submarine patrol and anti-aircraft defense, not surface combat against the most powerful warships afloat. Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague commanded Taffy 3 from his flagship Fanshawe Bay. A naval aviator from the class of 1917 at Annapolis, he had no illusions about what his ships could do against battleships. His task unit consisted of 6 Casablanca-class escort carriers, 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, and 4 John C. Butler-class destroyer escorts. The destroyers were USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, USS Hoel, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger, and USS Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos Hathaway. All 3 belonged to Destroyer Division 92, Destroyer Squadron 47. They had trained together extensively. They knew each other's capabilities, and they were about to face the supreme test. To understand the impossible odds these ships faced, consider the raw mathematics of naval combat. The Fletcher-class destroyer displaced approximately 2,050 tons at standard load and about 2,924 tons fully loaded. Her length measured 376 feet, with a beam of 39 feet 7 inches and a draft of 13 feet 9 inches. Steam turbines generating 60,000 shaft horsepower drove her through 2 screws at speeds up to 38 knots. Her primary armament consisted of 5 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in single mounts, controlled by a Mark 37 fire control system with radar direction. 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts fired the Mark 15 torpedo. Various anti-aircraft guns, typically 10 40mm Bofors and 7 20mm Oerlikons, completed her weapons fit. Her armor was essentially non-existent, thin steel plating designed to keep out seawater, not shells. She carried a crew of roughly 300 officers and enlisted men. Yamato displaced 72,000 tons at full load. Her length stretched 863 feet. Her main battery of 9 18.1-inch, Type 94 guns, were the largest ever mounted on a warship, arranged in 3 triple turrets. Each turret alone weighed 2,774 tons, roughly equivalent to an entire Fletcher-class destroyer. Her armor-piercing shells weighed 3,220 pounds each and could reach targets 26 miles away. Her belt armor measured 16.1 inches thick. Her turret faces were an astonishing 25.6 inches of hardened steel, nearly impervious to anything the Americans could throw at her. Secondary armament included 12 6.1-inch guns and dozens of anti-aircraft weapons. She carried a crew of approximately 2,700 men and could make 27 knots. One Yamato turret weighed more than an entire American destroyer. Yamato alone displaced as much as all of Taffy 3 combined. The remaining Japanese battleships included Nagato at 43,580 tons, with her 8 16.1-inch guns, and the fast battleships Kongo and Haruna, each at 36,600 tons, mounting 8 14-inch guns and capable of 30 knots. The 6 heavy cruisers, Chokai, Haguro, Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, and Tone, each displaced between 11,000 and 15,000 tons and carried 8 to 10 8-inch guns. 2 light cruisers, Yahagi and Noshiro, added more firepower. 11 destroyers completed the armada. In total, 23 Japanese warships with crushing superiority in every measure of firepower and armor. Any single one of these heavy cruisers outgunned the entire Taffy 3 destroyer screen. The men aboard Johnston, Hoel, and Heermann knew exactly what they were sailing toward. The mathematics of naval combat do not lie. 5-inch shells cannot penetrate battleship armor. Destroyer hulls cannot withstand 8-inch shells, much less 18-inch monsters. By every measure of firepower, armor, and tonnage, the American destroyers were hopelessly outmatched. But tonnage does not account for courage, and mathematics cannot measure the determination of men who refuse to accept defeat. The morning of October 25th dawned under low overcast with intermittent rain squalls. Visibility in clear patches reached approximately 20 nautical miles, but dropped to near zero in the squalls. The wind blew from the north-northeast, a small mercy that would prove critically important. It allowed eastward aircraft launches without the carriers having to turn toward the enemy, and caused smoke screens to drift favorably between the Japanese and the fleeing carriers. At approximately 0637, Ensign William C. Brooks, Jr., flying a torpedo bomber from St. Lo on anti-submarine patrol, spotted the Japanese fleet. His transmission crackled through every radio in Taffy 3. He reported seeing pagoda masts and the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship he had ever seen. Initially, some officers thought the ships might be Halsey's Third Fleet returning from the north. That hope died within minutes when lookouts identified the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships. By 0645, lookouts aboard the escort carriers observed anti-aircraft fire to the northwest as Japanese gunners tested their weapons. Surface radar confirmed the nightmare. A massive Japanese fleet was bearing down at high speed, approximately 34,000 yards away. The range was closing fast. At 0658, Japanese ships opened fire. Colored shell splashes erupted around the carriers. Nagato's shells raised pink geysers. Harunas were greenish-yellow. Kongos were blood-red. Yamatos were undyed white. Each Japanese ship used dye-loaded shells to spot its own fall of shot in the chaos of battle. At approximately 0700, Yamato opened fire with her forward, 6 18.1-inch guns, at the escort carrier White Plains from approximately 34,000 yards. Shells the weight of small automobiles screamed across the ocean. White Plains shuddered as near misses lifted her stern partially out of the water. Rear Admiral Sprague immediately ordered Taffy 3 to turn east at maximum speed toward a rain squall. He commanded all aircraft to launch, regardless of armament, even planes armed only for ground support or carrying depth charges instead of torpedoes. He ordered smoke screens laid and broadcast an urgent plain language request for assistance. His voice was steady, but everyone who heard the transmission understood. Taffy 3 was alone. Commander Ernest Evans did not wait for orders. The instant Japanese shells began falling among the carriers, Evans turned Johnston toward the enemy fleet on his own initiative. He ordered flank speed and addressed his crew over the intercom. All hands to general quarters. Prepare to attack major portion of the Japanese fleet. All engines ahead flank. Commence making smoke and stand by for a torpedo attack. Left full rudder. Johnston heeled over and charged directly toward 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. Alone. Johnston laid a protective smoke screen while zigzagging between the carriers and the Japanese formation. Her 5-inch guns opened fire at approximately 0710, targeting the leading heavy cruisers from 18,000 yards. Lieutenant Robert C. Hagen, the gunnery officer, concentrated fire on the heavy cruiser Kumano, flagship of Cruiser Division 7. Over 200 rounds of 5-inch fire slammed into Kumano's superstructure, setting her ablaze and shredding her exposed equipment. Fire control gear was smashed. Crewmen were cut down at their stations. The 5-inch shells could not sink a heavy cruiser, but they could wound her terribly. At approximately 0715, Evans closed to roughly 10,000 yards and ordered all torpedoes fired. 10 Mark 15 torpedoes streaked toward the Japanese cruiser column, each carrying a warhead of Torpex explosive capable of breaking a ship's back. The results at 0727 were devastating. At least one torpedo struck Kumano, blowing off her entire bow and reducing her speed to 12 knots. The heavy cruiser Suzuya stopped to evacuate the cruiser division commander from the crippled Kumano. Aircraft then damaged Suzuya's propeller with a near-miss bomb. 2 heavy cruisers were effectively removed from the battle by Johnston's solo charge. One destroyer had done what an entire fleet might have struggled to accomplish. Johnston's extraordinary run of luck ended violently minutes later. According to analysis of Japanese records by historian Robert Lundgren in 2014, Yamato herself fired on Johnston. Congo was blinded by a rain squall at the critical moment and could not see the target. Yamato was not. 3 18.1-inch shells struck aft below the waterline. Gun turrets 3, 4 and 5 were destroyed, their crews killed instantly. Massive geysers of water erupted around the ship. Johnston's speed dropped to 17 knots. 3 6.1-inch shells from Yamato's secondary battery hit the bridge area and torpedo director. Shrapnel scythed across the deck. Lieutenant Hagen later described the impact. It was like a puppy being smacked by a truck. Commander Evans suffered 2 fingers of his left hand severed by shrapnel. Additional wounds covered his hand, back, and face. His shirt was blown completely off by the blast. Multiple officers on the bridge were killed when the radar antenna crashed down onto the fire control platform. Johnston lost steering engine power, her gyro compass, and 3 of her 5 guns. Water poured into her engine rooms. Fires broke out in several compartments. By all rights, she should have been finished. She ducked into a passing rain squall for approximately 10 minutes of desperate damage control. Sailors fought fires with hoses and buckets. Damage control parties shored up bulkheads against flooding. Engineers rigged emergency steering while shell splashes erupted in the water around them. In those 10 minutes, Johnston's crew refused to let their ship die. Any other captain might have considered his duty done. Evans had already crippled 2 heavy cruisers. His ship was gutted, her firepower reduced by more than half, her speed cut nearly in 2. No one would have faulted him for retiring under the cover of smoke to save his remaining crew. Evans turned Johnston back toward the enemy. At 0716, Rear Admiral Sprague ordered Commander William Dow Thomas aboard Hoel to execute a formal torpedo attack. Thomas served as screen commander for Taffy 3 and held the rank of commander. Hoel was already under fire when she spotted the battleship Congo at 14,000 yards and charged. Hoel had been commissioned on July 29, 1943, at Bethlehem Steel in San Francisco. Her commanding officer, Commander Leon Samuel Kintberger, had assumed command only days before the battle. Thomas remained aboard as screen commander. Kintberger had barely had time to learn his ship before being asked to lead her into the most desperate battle imaginable. Almost immediately, the heavy cruiser Haguro scored 2 8-inch hits on Hoel's bridge. The fire control radar was destroyed, blinding her main battery. All voice radio communications went dead. Additional 8-inch hits destroyed the port engine and after generator. Hoel's speed dropped to 17 knots. Despite crippling damage, Commander Kintberger pressed the attack and fired 5 torpedoes at Congo from 7,000 yards. The battleship turned hard, and all 5 missed, their wakes visible crossing empty water. Kintberger refused to break off. Closing further into the battleship column, Hoel took a 16.1-inch shell from Nagato directly below the bridge. The shell punched clean through the ship. Secondary hits destroyed her forward engine room. She developed a 10-degree list to port. With his ship dying beneath him, Kintberger ordered the remaining 5 torpedoes fired at the battleship column. The results changed the course of the battle. Yamato and Nagato were forced to turn away to avoid the torpedo spreads. This maneuver forced Yamato to head north for approximately 10 minutes, effectively removing Kurita's flagship and the battle's most powerful weapon from the engagement at a critical moment. Kurita could not see what was happening. He could not coordinate his ships. The Japanese admiral lost tactical control of his fleet because a crippled American destroyer refused to stop fighting. At approximately 0750, Rear Admiral Sprague issued his famous order over the tactical frequency: small boys attack. Commander Amos Townsend Hathaway brought Heermann to flank speed and charged through the carrier formation. Heermann had been commissioned on July 6, 1943, also at Bethlehem Steel in San Francisco. Unlike her sisters, she had Alice Chalmers turbines rather than General Electric. Hathaway was a veteran commander, and Heermann had earned 9 battle stars in operations from Tarawa through the Solomons, New Ireland, and Palau. She was a tested ship with a tested crew. Smoke and squalls had reduced visibility to less than 100 yards. Hathaway ordered emergency astern twice to avoid collisions, missing other ships by less than 10 feet. At one point, Heermann nearly ran directly into White Plains. At 0754, Heermann fired 7 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Haguro, while pumping 5-inch shells at Chikuma. 5 torpedoes were intended for the spread, but 2 fired accidentally when crew members triggered them in the confusion of close combat. Haguro dodged all 7. Hathaway then turned toward the battleship column and fired his remaining 3 torpedoes at the battleship Haruna from only 4,400 yards, nearly point-blank range for a torpedo attack. Haruna evaded, but the torpedo wakes forced Yamato to continue maneuvering to avoid the threat, compounding Kurita's loss of tactical control. Remarkably, Heermann took no direct hits during her attack run. Her luck held even as shells splashed all around her. She would continue fighting for the remainder of the engagement, her guns blazing at any Japanese ship that came within range, emerging from the battle battered but afloat. The formal torpedo attacks were over. All torpedoes had been expended. What followed was a running fight through smoke and rain that lasted more than 2 additional hours, fought only with guns. Johnston, reduced to 2 working guns and 1 engine, continued engaging targets of opportunity. At 0820, Lieutenant Hagen spotted the battleship Congo at 7,000 yards. He later wrote that he looked at the unmistakable pagoda mast, muttered that he could surely see that, and opened fire. 30 rounds in 40 seconds. At least 15 hit the superstructure, scattering crew and smashing equipment. When Evans saw the escort carrier Gambia Bay under fire from cruisers, her thin hull being systematically torn apart by 8-inch shells, he ordered Hagen to commence firing on the cruiser. His intent was explicit. "Draw her fire on us and away from Gambia Bay," a crippled destroyer deliberately making itself a target to protect an escort carrier. Hagen later recalled thinking that Evans surely must be joking. A crippled tin can engaging in a deliberate slugging match with a heavy cruiser. At approximately 0850, Johnston spotted the light cruiser Yahagi and her destroyer squadron preparing a torpedo attack on the carriers. Johnston opened fire with aggressive volleys that disrupted the enemy formation. The attack forced the Japanese destroyers to fire their torpedoes early at extreme range. All went wild. This single engagement may have saved the remaining escort carriers from destruction. Hoel sank at approximately 0855 after sustaining over 40 shell hits. 5-inch, 8-inch, and 16-inch shells had torn her apart from stem to stern. She rolled over as her crew abandoned ship, men leaping into oil-covered water as the hull turned turtle beneath them. The Japanese destroyer, Isokaze, approached the sinking vessel. Her captain forbade his crew from firing on the survivors. He did not stop to rescue them, but neither did he murder them. It was a small mercy in the midst of slaughter. By 0920, Johnston had become the focus of concentrated fire from multiple Japanese destroyers. Her luck had finally run out. Shells knocked out her last engine. Evans, driven from the bridge by exploding 40mm ammunition, moved command to the fantail. He shouted steering orders through an open hatch to men turning the rudder by hand below decks. A ship that should have been dead continued fighting because her captain refused to give up. At 0945, Evans gave the order to abandon ship. Johnston sank at approximately 10:10, still firing until the water closed over her guns. As she went down, the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze closed to 1,000 yards. Her crew reportedly stood at attention as Commander Terauchi Masamichi saluted the sinking American destroyer. American survivors reported seeing this tribute rendered by their enemy. It was the highest honor enemy warriors could pay to each other. Ernest Edwin Evans was born August 13, 1908, in Pawnee, Oklahoma. He was half Cherokee and 1/4 Creek, the son of a father who had served in the United States Army. His grandfather had fought with the Union in the Civil War. Military service ran in his blood. He graduated from Central High School in Muskogee, enlisted in the Navy on May 29, 1926, and entered the United States Naval Academy on June 29, 1927. His yearbook described him as big-hearted, good company, and radical from birth. The description would prove prophetic. Evans served on the battleship Colorado and the destroyer Roper before aviation assignments with Scouting Squadron 9. He qualified as a naval aviator and then returned to surface ships. He took command of the old four-stack destroyer Alden on March 14, 1942, seeing action in the East Indies and Australian waters during the darkest days of the war when Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. Promoted to commander effective November 1, 1942, he was ordered to Seattle to fit out the new Fletcher-class destroyer Johnston. At Johnston's commissioning ceremony on October 27, 1943, exactly 1 year before her final battle, Evans stood before his assembled crew and made a declaration that defined everything that followed. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." The words echoed John Paul Jones, the father of the American Navy. Evans meant every one of them. His crew called him the Chief, though never to his face. The nickname honored his Native American heritage, but it also captured something essential about Evans himself. He led from the front. He expected everything from his men because he gave everything himself. He drilled them relentlessly, pushing Johnston to excel in gunnery and torpedo exercises. The night before the battle, Evans remarked to Lieutenant Hagen with characteristic understatement, "We are within 3 days of being 1 year old. It has been an uneventful year." Evans was last seen alive on Johnston's deck, shirtless and covered in blood, ordering his crew to abandon ship. Some survivors reported he was hit by shell fire after giving the abandoned ship order. Others say he made it to a damaged motor whaleboat that was later seen drifting empty. His body was never recovered. His Medal of Honor citation reads in part that Commander Evans was the first to lay a smoke screen and to open fire as an enemy task force, vastly superior in number, firepower, and armor, rapidly approached. It states that he gallantly diverted the powerful blasts of hostile guns from the lightly armed and armored carriers under his protection. That he shifted command to the fantail, shouted steering orders through an open hatch to men turning the rudder by hand, and battled furiously until Johnston lay dead in the water after 3 hours of fierce combat. Evans's widow Margaret accepted the Medal of Honor on his behalf in September 1945. Their 2 sons watched as their father was recognized as the first Native American in the United States Navy to receive the nation's highest military honor. The Japanese saw something very different that morning off Samar. When Yamato's lookouts spotted the American ships at approximately 0644, Kurita's center force was still transitioning from nighttime cruising formation. His identification manuals contained no silhouettes for escort carriers. These small, slow, converted merchant hulls were not considered significant warships by Japanese naval intelligence. Kurita and his staff misidentified them as fleet carriers. They believed they faced Essex-class and Independence-class carriers, heavy cruisers and destroyers. In other words, they believed they had found Halsey's Third Fleet. Kurita ordered a course change, then almost immediately signaled general attack, a command for each division to attack independently rather than in coordination. This was a catastrophic tactical error. Combined with the incomplete formation change, it scattered his overwhelming firepower advantage across miles of ocean. Ships cut across each other's firing lines. Some could not fire at all for fear of hitting friendly vessels. Rear Admiral Koyanagi, Kurita's chief of staff, later admitted that little heed was paid to coordination. The most powerful surface fleet Japan ever assembled became an armed mob. The aggressive ferocity of the American destroyer attacks reinforced the Japanese delusion. No force so small would charge battleships. Therefore, the Japanese reasoned, these must be heavy cruisers and fleet carriers with powerful escorts. The smoke screens, the rain squalls, and the constant aircraft attacks prevented Kurita from ever clearly seeing what he actually faced. He was fighting ghosts in the fog. A cruel irony worked in the Americans' favor. Yamato's massive armor-piercing shells were designed to penetrate battleship armor before detonating. The fuses were set for thick steel. Against the unarmored escort carriers and destroyers, many shells passed clean through without exploding. They punched holes in one side and out the other, but failed to cause the catastrophic internal damage they would have inflicted on armored warships. At approximately 0911, Kurita ordered all units to cease pursuit and take a northerly course. His withdrawal may be the most consequential tactical decision of the Pacific War. Koyanagi documented the reasons for the retreat. Nishimura's southern force had been destroyed at Surigao Strait, making the coordinated pincer attack impossible. The center force was hours behind schedule and would not reach Leyte Gulf until afternoon, negating any surprise. Intercepted American radio communications indicated aircraft reinforcements arriving within 2 hours. Kurita feared concentrated air attack in the confined waters of Leyte Gulf, where he could not maneuver. And critically, fuel shortage was becoming desperate, with no tankers available in Philippine waters. Contributing factors included Kurita's extreme exhaustion. He had been on the bridge for 48 continuous hours without sleep. He had already survived the torpedoing of his flagship Atago 2 days earlier, plunging into the sea and being rescued by a destroyer. Half his signal staff had been killed. His last scout aircraft was lost shortly after 0900, leaving him completely blind. He believed he had already sunk 4 carriers and several cruisers. He had actually sunk 1 escort carrier by gunfire. The rest were lies told by smoke and rain and the desperate courage of men in destroyers. Of Johnston's 327 crew, 186 were lost. Approximately 50 were killed by enemy action during the battle itself. 45 died on life rafts from wounds sustained during the fighting, their shipmates unable to save them. 92 were alive in the water after the ship sank and simply disappeared, their fates almost certainly sealed by sharks in the days that followed. 141 men survived. Of Hoel's 339 crew, 253 were killed. Only 86 men survived. Hoel had sustained over 40 shell hits from weapons ranging from 5 inches to 16 inches. Heermann survived the battle with 4 killed and 17 wounded. She was the only Taffy 3 destroyer to make it through, her hull riddled with shrapnel but intact. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, which fought alongside the 3 destroyers with equal courage, lost approximately 90 of her 224-man crew in battle. With additional men perishing during the long wait for rescue, she earned the nickname the Destroyer Escort that fought like a battleship. The escort carrier Gambier Bay became the only American carrier sunk by enemy surface gunfire in the entire war. Of her ship's company of approximately 860, 147 were killed. She went down under the guns of heavy cruisers, her flight deck torn apart by 8-inch shells. St. Lo was hit by a kamikaze strike at approximately 10:50. She sank roughly 30 minutes later at approximately 11:25, becoming the first major warship destroyed by the suicide weapon that would terrorize the fleet in the months ahead. Total Taffy. 3 losses reached 5 ships sunk, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. Approximately 1,161 men were killed or missing. Over 900 were wounded. The Japanese paid their own price. 3 heavy cruisers were sunk during or immediately after the engagement. Chokai was hit by bombs that destroyed her forward machinery room. Dead in the water and unable to flee, she was scuttled by torpedoes from the destroyer Fujinami. Fujinami herself was sunk 2 days later with all hands by American aircraft, taking every Chokai survivor she had rescued to the bottom. Chikuma took an aerial torpedo and progressively lost power as flooding spread through her engineering spaces. Additional torpedo hits from carrier aircraft finished her. The destroyer Nowaki rescued survivors, but Nowaki was sunk the following day with all hands. Only 1 Chikuma crewman survived the entire war, having drifted ashore on debris without boarding Nowaki. Suzuya suffered progressive damage from near-miss bombs that detonated her long-lance torpedoes, the powerful weapons that had sunk so many Allied ships earlier in the war. Uncontrollable fires consumed her, and she sank that afternoon. Kumano, crippled by Johnston's torpedo hit, never fully recovered. Fitted with a temporary bow at Manila, she was repeatedly attacked over the following month. American submarines and aircraft hunted her relentlessly. She was finally sunk on November 25, 1944, exactly 1 month after the battle. Total Japanese casualties during the engagement exceeded 2,700 killed and wounded. While Taffy 3 fought for survival, a drama of messages unfolded across the Pacific. Kincaid's desperate transmissions pleaded for fast battleships at Leyte Gulf at once. Plain language messages declared his situation critical. These transmissions were delayed hours by overloaded communications relay through Manus. By the time Halsey received them, the battle was nearly over. At 0944, Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor composed what would become one of the most famous messages in naval history. The core message simply asked where Task Force 34 was located. However, the encoded transmission included security padding, random filler phrases designed to confuse Japanese cryptanalysts. The leading phrase was, "Turkey trots to water." The trailing phrase was, "The world wonders." Both were supposed to be separated from the real message by double consonant markers and stripped out before delivery. The communications officer on Halsey's flagship New Jersey correctly removed the leading padding. He left the trailing phrase in because it appeared to fit the context of the message. Halsey read a demand to know where Task Force 34 was, followed by what appeared to be a cutting rebuke. In reality, the phrase was random padding, but Halsey had no way to know this. Halsey later recalled being stunned as if struck in the face. The paper rattled in his hands. He snatched off his cap, threw it on the deck, and shouted something he was later ashamed to remember. His chief of staff reportedly grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him, demanding to know what the hell the matter was. Despite this, Halsey continued north for another full hour. At approximately 1100, with his battleships just 42 miles from Ozawa's decoy carriers, he finally ordered Task Force 34 to reverse course south. The battleships were over 300 miles from Samar. They arrived far too late. Kurita had already withdrawn. Nimitz later wrote privately to Admiral King that the fact that Kurita's fleet did not completely destroy Taffy 3 was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. The survivor's own words capture what no reconstruction can convey. Lieutenant Robert C. Hagen, Johnston's gunnery officer and senior surviving officer, wrote the first published account for a major magazine in May 1945. Of Evans, he wrote that the skipper was a fighting man from the soles of his broad feet to the ends of his straight black hair. He was an Oklahoman and proud of the Indian blood he had in him. They called him the Chief, though not to his face. Johnston was a fighting ship, but Evans was the heart and soul of her. On the battle's opening moments, Hagen recalled that he had just asked the mess boy to bring him up a cup of coffee when all hell broke loose at 6:50 in the morning. When ordered to fire on a heavy cruiser to draw fire away from the sinking Gambia Bay, Hagen recalled thinking that Evans surely must be joking. A crippled tin can engaging in a deliberate slugging match with a heavy cruiser. After abandoning ship, Hagen experienced one of the battle's surreal moments. His torpedo man Jim O'Gorick swam over and, as brightly as if meeting on a street corner, reported that they had gotten off all 10 torpedoes and they had run hot, straight, and normal. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of Samuel B. Roberts made the announcement that defined the battle's spirit before his ship charged into action. He told his crew over the ship-wide intercom that this would be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected. They would do what damage they could. As Roberts passed the shattered Johnston, Copeland saw Evans on the fantail, stripped to the waist and covered with blood. Evans looked up and casually waved, as though passing on a Sunday cruise. Commander Kintberger of Hoel later wrote that fully cognizant of the inevitable result of engaging such vastly superior forces, his men performed their assigned duties coolly and efficiently until their ship was shot from under them. Hoel survivors left harrowing accounts of their ordeal in the water. Glenn Parkin recalled that what made it bad was when a man would die and there was nothing anyone could do. They would take off their dog tags and the bodies would float 3 or maybe 5 feet before the sharks would get them. George Miller said his group would let the dead go at night to spare the agony of seeing sharks take their comrades in daylight. Japanese sailors too bore witness. Survivors reported Japanese crews yelling the word samurai and tossing food and water packets to Americans in the water. Rescue was agonizingly slow. Communication errors, fears of submarine attack, and uncertainty about Japanese naval presence delayed organized rescue for approximately 48 to 52 hours. On the night of October 26th, rescuers spotted red, green, and white flares from life rafts. They began picking up Gambia Bay survivors just after midnight. Johnston survivors were recovered on October 27th, exactly 1 year after their ship's commissioning ceremony. Hoel survivors had been in the water approximately 48 hours. Their action report stated bluntly that had the remaining survivors been left immersed for another 24 hours, there would have been no survivors at all. During those days in the water, men endured open ocean exposure, dehydration, ingestion of fuel oil that coated the surface, hallucinations brought on by thirst and exhaustion, and relentless shark attacks. Thick black fuel oil from the sunken ships coated survivors, causing chemical burns and violent nausea. Many men died of wounds that might have been survivable with prompt medical attention. Approximately 1,150 survivors were ultimately rescued from the sunken ships. All of Taffy 3 received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest award that can be given to a military unit. Commander Hathaway of Heermann received the Navy Cross. Evans' posthumous Medal of Honor was one of only 2 awarded to destroyer captains during the entire Pacific War. On March 31, 2021, explorer Victor Vescovo, piloting the deep submergence vehicle Limiting Factor, positively identified the wreck of Johnston at 21,180 feet beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea. It was then the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed. Her hull number 557 was clearly visible on both sides of the bow. 2 5-inch gun turrets remained in place. Most remarkably, her guns still pointed in the direction they were firing when she sank, frozen in the act of defiance. Vescovo observed simply that she still looked like she was fighting. Rear Admiral Samuel Cox of the Naval History and Heritage Command called the discovery a resolution to one of the greatest last stands in all naval history, which ended in a completely unpredictable American victory against enormous odds. No human remains were seen. Nothing was disturbed. The expedition team laid a wreath on the water above the wreck site in tribute to the men who had given their lives there 77 years earlier. In June 2022, Vescovo discovered Samuel B. Roberts even deeper, at approximately 22,600 feet, surpassing Johnston as the deepest shipwreck ever found. Both ships rest in the Philippine Trench, preserved by the crushing pressure and near-freezing temperatures of the abyss. Hoel and Gambier Bay have not yet been located, their final resting places still unknown somewhere in those dark waters. In November 2023, the United States Navy announced that Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer DDG-141 would be named USS Ernest E. Evans. Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, the first Native American cabinet secretary, was named the ship's sponsor. The 3 destroyers of Taffy 3, supported by Samuel B. Roberts and hundreds of aircraft flying with whatever ordnance they could find, achieved something that defied every calculation of naval warfare. They did not merely delay Kurita, they broke his attack. Johnston's torpedo crippled 2 heavy cruisers. Hoel's and Heermann's torpedoes drove Yamato out of the fight at the critical moment. Johnston's aggressive fire disrupted an entire Japanese destroyer squadron's torpedo attack on the carriers. The cumulative effect of smoke, squalls, aircraft, and suicidal surface charges convinced Kurita he faced a major fleet formation rather than a handful of escort carriers. The Japanese center force retreated with its mission unaccomplished. 130,000 American soldiers on the Leyte beaches, hundreds of supply ships and transports, the entire Philippine liberation campaign, all survived because men in 2,000-ton destroyers charged 72,000-ton battleships and refused to stop fighting, even as their ships broke apart beneath them. The Battle off Samar remains the finest moment of the United States Navy, not because the odds were beaten, not because mathematics were somehow overcome, because men who knew the odds chose to charge anyway. Commander Ernest Evans knew, Lieutenant Robert Hagen knew, Commander Leon Kintberger knew, Commander Amos Hathaway knew. Every sailor on those 3 destroyers who watched the pagoda masts rising on the horizon knew exactly what they faced. They charged anyway. And in doing so, they wrote one of history's most extraordinary chapters of courage under fire. The Battle off Samar stands as proof that in warfare, the human spirit can accomplish what mathematics says is impossible. 3 destroyers challenged an armada. 2 of them paid the ultimate price. But together, they saved an army and changed the course of a war.